I'd like to first extend a warm welcome to Viv Claver from the Melbourne Integrative Oncology Group. Whether recently diagnosed, during treatment or beyond, evidence-based and personalised dietary and lifestyle modifications can have a significant impact on someone's health, wellbeing and quality of life. And with the increase in research around various diet protocols in cancer, Vivian is a great resource to help you sift through the fads and focus on an approach that is practical, helpful, and sustainable for you. This session aims to cover common popular dietary approaches, as well as general dietary habits, food as medicine, and evidence-based functional foods. Viv is experienced in supporting patients with upper GI cancers, including esophageal, gastric, pancreatic, liver, and biliary, and will continue to provide a high-level overview on what small adjustments can be made to support patients post-surgery, treatment, and include complications such as diabetes or malnutrition syndromes. If you have any broad-based questions throughout the session, please feel free to pop them in the chat throughout the presentation, and Viv will do her best to answer. She cannot give any personal advice though, and she'll reinforce that throughout her presentation. So thank you, Viv.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I'll just share my screen now to show you some slides, if you'll bear with me just for a second. Okay. All right, so we can jump straight in. So as Alison mentioned, I'm a clinical nutritionist at the Melbourne Integrative Oncology Group. And we as a team exclusively support patients with cancer. This is our bread and butter. And we do a lot of research into what we might be able to recommend to make this experience that little bit easier, that little bit lighter for you. Now, whether someone is at an early stage of diagnosis or currently in treatment, right into palliation or survivorship, we do believe that no matter what stage you're at, it is valuable to inform yourself about helpful choices that you can make regarding your diet and your lifestyle, to have that active participation in your healthcare. Now, gastrointestinal cancers are ones that we do see very often, particularly due to the impact that the treatment can have on your digestion or nutrient intake. So a lot of patients like yourselves do come and seek out the support of a dietitian or a nutritionist. And we also find that that's very much driven by the internet, and that the messaging that is found online can be extremely confusing. So today I want to help sift through some of that messaging and simplify what you might be able to do to nourish your body. So today we'll be covering some key dietary risk factors when it comes to upper GI cancers. I'll talk about the general framework of a diet that is recommended both for the prevention but also the management of upper GI cancers. And this is based on reliable large-scale research. We'll talk a little bit about functional foods to include and sort of what I call food as medicine interventions, and some of the nutritional challenges that you might be facing, and depending on your individual situation, what we need to do in terms of dietary modifications. Now, there have been a couple of other webinars in the past that cover digestion in the broader sense, including the roles of the organs such as the esophagus, stomach, liver, pancreas, etc. So I won't be covering that, but please do reach out to PanCare if you need the link to those webinars. They're very helpful as well. Okay, so let's jump straight in. Why are we even talking about this? So again, whatever stage you're at, or even if you have a family member that might have a cancer and you find that you're at a higher risk, optimizing your nutritional intake always has a significant impact on the biochemistry of your body. It can help prevent initial cancer formation, so risk reduction, but it can also really improve your health if you've had a diagnosis throughout treatment. It can lessen or prevent some of those treatment-associated side effects. It can reduce the risk of other comorbidities and long-term complications, such as cardiovascular disease, treatment-induced diabetes, etc. New research is even suggesting that dietary change can contribute to better outcomes by way of increasing the tolerability of your treatment or adherence to treatment. And as mentioned, it can also change the biochemistry of your body so that we can potentially help to slow that cancer growth rate. So it's a win-win situation, and it's never too late to make positive change. The goal of nutritional intervention is to optimize your health, whether it's supporting your immune system or preventing or fighting infection, promoting your energy pathways, helping detoxification through the liver and the digestive system, supporting your lean muscle mass, protecting the microbiome in your gut, which has such a huge role in the body and in fighting infection and supporting healthy longevity. Because after all, we want you to not just to survive, but to thrive. Okay, so let's look at some of the dietary risk factors that come from large population-based studies. Now, none of this information is new, of course. We know this. And yet we do see that these foods are still a huge part in the average Australian diet. The biggest problems are things like red and processed meat intake, and it's really the quantity that's the real issue there. Fried foods due to the poor quality oils that are used, salt, refined carbohydrates, and a general lack of vegetable and fruit intake. A report from 2018 showed that only 5% of Australian adults get their recommended intake of vegetables and fruit in a day. And now these kind of habits and foods have one thing in common, and that is that they are pro-inflammatory. So they contribute to inflammation in the body. And inflammation is a word you'll hear me use a lot in this presentation, because a lot of what we're doing and trying to achieve is actually to reduce the process of inflammation. Now, small amounts of inflammation, of course, are normal or is normal. It helps us to heal a wound or fight an infection. But long-term chronic inflammation is really what's the problem here. And it's linked to many chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease or types of dementia, and of course, cancer. Now, looking more specifically at the research, we can see that diet-related inflammation is absolutely a risk factor for upper GI cancers. High inflammatory markers during treatment are associated with poor prognosis. And chronic inflammation is also associated with poorer nutritional intake and then resulting in weight loss and again, poorer outcomes. So reducing or mediating that inflammation is really important in terms of, addressing that biochemistry of your body. So how do we do that? You guessed it, it's an anti-inflammatory diet that I tend to recommend most to my patients. It used to kind of be known as the Mediterranean diet, but I find that gets misinterpreted a little bit. People saying, oh, Italians eat a lot of pasta, so that should be fine, but that's actually not correct. We want that traditional Mediterranean diet, which really is very much plant-based and rich in vegetables and fruit. These plant foods that have color and that are as close to nature as possible are the main source of vitamins, minerals, and of course, antioxidants and phytonutrients or plant nutrients that have time and time again found to be protective and anti-inflammatory. An anti-inflammatory diet also contains lots of those healthy fats or unsaturated fats, for example, extra virgin olive oil, avocado, fish, nuts, and seeds. Again, these fats are considered anti-inflammatory. Particularly fish is in that category, especially the small varieties such as sardines and mackerel. And then, of course, also other types of lean proteins such as legumes, and also small amounts of eggs and good quality meat. It's really about unprocessed food. So when we talk about grains, it's really whole grains and legumes that are the main source of fiber and complex carbohydrate. And a big variety is a big focus is of course on variety, because we want that broad spectrum of nutrients and broad spectrum of different types of fiber to feed the microbiome and provide nutrients that our body needs. Now, of course, we always need to consider, though, that adjustments do need to be made according to your own situation. Some of you might simply not be able to tolerate high amounts of fats, or you might not be able to tolerate very fibrous foods. So these are our broad guidelines to achieve an anti-inflammatory diet. Now, to visualize it, here's a really good pyramid. So some of you might remember the old school food pyramid, which had all the grains at the bottom, and it used to be said that you need to have your 6 to 8 serves of grains a day. That's absolutely been debunked. And this is a better interpretation, I find, of an anti-inflammatory diet, or a diet that the body needs. The biggest section should really be those colorful plant foods because they are the highest in nutrient content. Then we've got the whole grains and other foods from there as we go. So I just find this is a really good little visualization of how your shopping cart should look to achieve that anti-inflammatory diet. Now, how to, I will obviously go into much more detail, but just to broadly start with, how do we get to this stage? Where do we start? Now, you may start with those fats that I mentioned. Simply go to your pantry, have a little look through, and take out anything that's not an olive oil. We don't need canola, sunflower oil, etc. Be conscious of relying a little bit less on animal meat, such as red meat, lamb, and chicken, and try to incorporate a little bit more fish where you can. Not everybody likes fish, that's okay, so it doesn't have to be included, but if you do tolerate it, it's a great source of those anti-inflammatory fats. And remember, there are so many different recipes and ways to change up the flavor of fish if it's too fishy for you, and different types of fish that you can use. We definitely want to increase those oils if you can tolerate them. Avocado into your salads, or some nuts and seeds into a smoothie or into your porridge, etc. So small things can go a long way here. Now, I do just want to note that dairy as a total isn't ideal, but fermented dairy such as yogurt or kefir is actually absolutely fine. Because that's fermented, it's less pro-inflammatory than the other types of dairy like milk. So it's absolutely okay to include small amounts of Greek yogurt and eggs as well. Okay, so we've talked about fats. When we talk about inflammation, that is largely driven by the types of fat that we eat. So that's why I focused a lot on those foods initially. But the second thing that I get asked the most about is carbohydrates. In fact, it's probably the dietary change that I see the most when someone has received a cancer diagnosis. People tend to cut out sugar or cut out carbs in general. The question is, what is a carb, and are all carbs the same, and does sugar actually feed cancer? I get that question a lot. So if we look at the different types of carbohydrates, no, absolutely not. They're not all the same. The problem is really the refining process that has come with modern agriculture, and the fact that in an Australian or Western diet, we do rely so heavily on those refined carbohydrates. We've all grown up with cereal for breakfast, sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, and it's the type of carbohydrate and the quantity of those carbohydrates that's the problem. Ultimately, all carbohydrates get broken down into a single molecule called glucose. And the difference is, or the question is, how quickly does that happen? And how much glucose in total is produced? So is it a low carbohydrate food or a high carbohydrate food? And does that convert very quickly? But then the question around, does sugar actually feed cancer? Maybe. There is some research to suggest that the types of cancers that are found in the upper gastrointestinal tract do like glucose as a potential fuel source. Now, this does not mean that it's the only fuel source and that you have to cut out carbohydrates. That is sort of a catastrophizing of that process that might be happening. And we simply don't know enough yet about cancer metabolism to say that cutting out all carbohydrates is a useful intervention. So at this stage, we don't need to cut out all carbohydrates, but it certainly is a good idea to cut out those refined sugars, those refined carbs, and replace them for more complex and nutrient carbohydrate options such as whole grains, potatoes, vegetables, fruits, etc. Ultimately, what we want to achieve is stable blood sugar levels, which is helpful for the way you feel, for your energy levels, for nausea, for all sorts of things. So we want that real sort of stability in our carbohydrate consumption and metabolism. All right, so it's all about finding balance and being sensible. So again, how do we do this? We do want that kind of low carb approach, and that fits in very well with an anti-inflammatory diet, because the anti-inflammatory diet, being very rich in whole and unprocessed foods, is already low carb in itself. But ultimately, it's about avoiding those refined products, sugars, and processed foods, move away from things that are in boxes and packaging, and move and shop mostly from the fresh vegetable and fruit aisle. Where you can, choose a complex carbohydrate over refined one, so swapping your cereal for rolled oats, your white rice for brown rice, quinoa, sweet potato, etc. And also, when you're creating a meal, think about those food groups. Where is my protein coming from? Where are my veggies? Don't just structure it around a big bowl of pasta. Always think color and proteins first before reaching for the carbs. Okay. Now, hand in hand with the carbohydrate conversation is a concept or a protocol called the ketogenic diet. I'm sure some of you have heard of this before. A ketogenic diet ultimately means basically no carbs. So do we need to go low carb or no carb? A ketogenic diet consists of 70% fat, and extremely minimal carbs. So it actually cuts out all grains and all fruit and all starchy vegetables as well. It is a bit of a buzzword in oncology at the moment, but the research is actually still very, very limited. The research actually focuses around weight loss and obesity. And again, a lot of people with a cancer diagnosis are actually not on that spectrum. They often tend to be losing too much weight in treatment. So it's not quite relevant when we look at cancers of the gastrointestinal tract. Not to mention whether it actually has an anti-cancer benefit is still very debated. So I actually don't tend to recommend this diet in an upper gastrointestinal cancer. It just has far too many complications with it. But if it is something that you're really interested in, I highly recommend for you to get support and work with a practitioner to even assess whether it is suitable in your case. But as a baseline, I can see somebody talking, but I can't hear you. Apologies, you're on mute. I will answer your questions in a moment. But ultimately, yes, so I would tend to say, let's steer away from any drastic exclusion of a whole food group, and stick to a well-balanced, high-nutrient diet. Okay, now we've talked about carbohydrates and fats. So just briefly, of course, we need to talk about proteins to cover all the macronutrients. Protein is a really important nutrient, and in some cases, it is the most important one because it forms essentially the building blocks of all of our cells. It helps tissue repair after surgery or after chemo and radiation. It helps balance your blood sugar levels, supports detoxification, and helps maintain your lean muscle mass. So lots and lots of benefits to having good sources of protein in the diet. I won't go into too much detail. There is a calculation that can be done as to exactly how much protein you need. So again, that would be something you would do with a practitioner. But ultimately, what you want to kind of aim for is having a source of protein with every meal and snack. And here's a list of some really good ones that you can incorporate that are easily digested and are also anti-inflammatory. Some people like to use protein powders. I'm not against those at all. They're a really easy way of adding a nice hit of protein to the diet, especially if you are losing that bit of weight. But the quality really matters. We want to stay away from wheat and whey and soy, which are the ones usually in supermarkets, and look out for additives like sugar, etc. So a good idea is to go to a health food store and actually speak to the staff there and say, I'm looking for a really clean product. What can you recommend? And then, of course, like I said, it's all about balance. So small amounts of meat are actually okay. We just don't want it every single day or in large quantities. Okay, so we spoke about macronutrients. Now I want to talk a little bit more about functional foods and those micronutrients that are found in foods. Okay, and I call these functional foods. So they are specific foods that have been researched in an upper GI presentation or a cancer presentation, and have been found to have a benefit. So we like to keep everything that we recommend evidence-based rather than stabbing in the dark. And I'll show you in a moment some examples of the types of evidence or the types of research articles that I read. Ultimately, the thing that is so protective in plant foods and why we always harp on about a plant-based diet is the is the phytonutrient content, so the plant nutrient content, also known as antioxidants. They often have very fancy, complicated names. There's a great little rule of thumb to go by, which is the brighter the color of the food, the higher the antioxidant amount, because usually the antioxidants are actually found in the color pigment of that food. On top of that, you want to try and eat a rainbow. So when you're buying or you're at the shops, don't just grab your tomatoes, cucumbers, and lettuce. Really branch out and think, have I got something yellow? Have I got something orange or something purple, even black, blackberries, etc. Now, whether you incorporate these foods raw or cooked, that completely depends on your digestive capacity. You might have to blend foods into a smoothie or blend them into a soup to ease digestion, but there are lots of ways in how you can incorporate more color into your diet. We have found, of course, with research that colorful fresh vegetables are the things is the dietary modification that is most protective. As I mentioned, it's the polyphenols that are important in the color pigment of the plants, and that there's lots of research to back this up. But what I want to say is that this is not a sudden miracle cure. So some of the articles I'm going to show you in a moment have some really compelling language and sound really great. But ultimately, we need to be sensible and realize that the body needs a whole spectrum of nutrients, and we need to support healthy cells as much as we need to support our symptoms. So we want to include the foods where we can in a very sensible way. So these are the kinds of articles that we look for and look at when we look at food as medicine in a cancer perspective. So often it's a research article that looks at a very particular compound in the food, and I'm not expecting you to remember all of these or know what they are. But ultimately, this is where we can think, yep, if it's reducing a risk, it's also going to have a benefit if you've already had a diagnosis, because ultimately these food compounds and phytonutrients change the biochemistry of the body in a beneficial way to stop and reduce those dodgy growth processes from happening. Now, lignans, quercetin, and resveratrol are basically found in a whole spectrum of colorful foods: leafy greens, apples, onions, grapes, skins, etc. It all means eat a diet that's rich in color and variety. This particular study looks at one type of cancer. Then we've got other studies like this that look at different nutrients in pancreatic cancer. So lots and lots of articles like that are supporting the use of a colorful and bright diet. Then we've got studies like this, which say camphorol, which is another food compound found in lots of vegetables and fruit, that actually inhibits cell proliferation. So that means that it stops that dodgy cell growth. And in this case, it's in a esophageal SCC. So this is where we think, okay, how can we incorporate that food to create a functional benefit or a meaningful change in the body? Okay. Green leafy vegetables for the win. Now, fish, I've absolutely harped on a lot about today, and that's because it's one of the most researched foods, and it's so protective in terms of so many things. So it does reduce the risk of many types of cancer. Liver is just one of them, but there are articles like this for most GI cancers, actually. Then there are specific studies on how that compound is working. So it's really through those cytokines, which are those inflammatory mediators. So by reducing that inflammation and that process, it can, again, slow that growth potentially. And then there are studies that even look at human populations where they're using fish oils in conjunction with treatment or to reduce particular side effects. Okay. Now, this particular study here, you can see that it's omega-3 in an intravenous form. That's not possible in Australia. So what I'm trying to highlight is that we really use these articles to make an informed decision about the foods that we then want to incorporate in a functional way. Trust me, there's no way of getting intravenous fish oil that doesn't make sense, but as a functional food, absolutely, let's incorporate it. It's going to be helpful. Just on fish oil, actually, that's reminding me, that's obviously a very popular supplement that people use. And again, I just want to be highlighting for you to be very careful with that and check with your medical team. So fish oil does have that mild blood thinning effect, particularly if you're on a blood thinner. You can overdo it when you're taking a supplement, but as a food form, it can absolutely be a good idea of incorporating that. Okay, a couple of other functional foods, and I'll be talking a little bit about how you can incorporate these. One of my favorites is green tea. And in fact, a lot of people don't like green tea because it's so bitter, but the trick is to have it in a very weak way. You don't have to keep the tea bag in there and make a very bitter tea. That just extracts tannins. What we want is the initial polyphenols from the tea. So just about 90 seconds of the tea bag is enough, and you will get a nice amount of the polyphenols, but not so many of the tannins. Plenty of evidence of the protective effects of green tea. Populations that drink more green tea have lower risks of upper GI cancers, etc. So that's a really great one that you can incorporate into your hydration routine. Nuts are very well researched as well, again, because of those essential fatty acids that are found in nuts. So they're a really great little snack to incorporate. And then we've got things like broccoli. Again, that falls into the greens category. They have particular compounds called sulforaphane that we want to have. And then my absolute favorite is anthocyanins, which are the antioxidants found in berries. Okay, so highlighting the absolute power of plants, the way that we can use food as medicine to add that little bit extra of support in our diet to optimize the nutrient content and that biochemistry of our body. Okay. Now, that was a list of a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo with technical words, etc. So my job is to break that down and translate that into a sensible and useful thing to incorporate into the diet. So here's like almost a bit of a shopping list for you, I suppose. And those foods that I mentioned there. Berries are in season now. They're cheaper. They're delicious. Give them a good wash and eat them raw, or you can even get frozen one and pop them into a smoothie. Very easy way of ticking that box and getting lots of those beautiful anthocyanins in your diet. Fish, a great way to start if you do rely more on meat is to alternate. You don't have to go pesco vegetarian straight away. You can start by simply going, one day I'll have a meat dish, the next day I'll have fish, and the day after that meat again. So slow and steady making those changes. Nuts and seeds, again, they can be a little bit hard to digest, but adding them into a smoothie can be really helpful. Just a nice handful of raw, good quality nuts. Tofu wasn't specifically a functional food, but I do like incorporating this one because so many people don't like tofu. We don't know how to cook it very well. It often tastes very bland, but it is actually such a great source of protein. And particularly something like a pumpkin soup, which is very popular, is a very low protein food. But then by just adding in a block of silken tofu and blending that up, the tofu disappears and you have a beautiful amount of protein in that soup. Okay. Broccoli, again, think out of the square. You don't have to crunch on raw broccoli if that's not your thing. But again, that could be blended into a soup or, chopped up really finely into a salad if you're having salads at the moment. Kale, again, a smoothie or a juice. I love a green smoothie. If you do find your nutrient or vegetable intake is a little bit low, chuck a whole bunch of things into a blender and blend it up, mixing some veggies with some fruit to get that nice flavor, and you'll get a massive hit of fiber and plant nutrients in the one go. All right, so a couple of ideas for you there. And then I want to share an image, which I really like, to show again that kind of balance that we're really after. So if you're looking down at your plate or the ingredients that you're chopping to add to a soup, for example, what is the ratio that we have there? And so often I see really that carbohydrates takes up the most part of the plate, and then there's a little bit of protein and a little bit of green for good measure. But we really want to flip that and have really a good section of the plate covered in those bright plant foods, and then a source of complex carbohydrates and a source of protein. Okay, now again, it doesn't have to be raw or like this on a plate. Take that whole thing, chuck it into a soup, blend it up to make it more easily digested. So the big question that I always get is, what about supplements? So I've talked about these food compounds and the studies say, it can stop cell growth and proliferation. Can't I just take a supplement and will it cure my cancer? I do get that question all the time. Ultimately, we don't know how that's going to look in a human body. So a lot of those studies are done in a test tube, and they don't take into account that the body has lots of factors in terms of metabolism, etc. And the biggest problem with supplementation is the issue around the potential interaction that a nutrient supplement can have with your medication. Okay, so I very much urge you not to self-prescribe anything. Always check with a practitioner, because just in the way that your body can change for the better and the biochemistry of your body can be improved with a nutritional supplement, a nutrient can actually change the way that your body absorbs, uses, or detoxifies a drug. And of course, number one, we need to make sure that nothing impacts the efficacy of your treatment. Okay, so that's the biggest problem about nutritional supplements, and it is a real concern. It doesn't mean that you can't take any. There are absolutely some that are very helpful, but you need to have the right practitioner who really knows what they're doing in order to use those things safely. The other problem is, particularly if you buy something over the counter, you've just got no idea if that's a high quality product, whether you're even going to absorb it, or whether it will even work. So I highly recommend to not spend your money on lots of things on over-the-counter supplements, and always get advice first. But certainly the best way of incorporating these helpful nutrients is through diet and through food as medicine. All right. Now, couple of caveats that I do need to mention. All of the above that I just mentioned would be great and an ideal situation, but we of course have to absolutely take into account your own individual situations. I'm sure you have all experienced some of these challenges throughout your treatment, whether it's a change in taste and appetite where all you can tolerate is a piece of bread with butter. That's okay. You might have some difficulty with swallowing. In that case, things like soups and smoothies might be a bit better. If you've had a gastrectomy, you surely are dealing with dumping syndrome, which is very much influenced by things like carbohydrates versus proteins and fats. There might be treatment-induced diabetes, which influences what you should be eating and when you should be eating. Whipple surgeries, etc., can lead to digestive issues or malabsorption issues. So there are really a lot of complications that can happen, and a lot of things that need to be taken into account. And none of the dietary changes that I mentioned before are helpful at all if your body isn't getting the basics of what it needs. So again, working with a practitioner to first of all address weight loss and malnutrition in the first instance, and then you can start to make some of those additions, as I mentioned earlier, to add that to a balanced diet. Okay, so we are ready to recap. Ultimately, what I'm trying to convey is that diet can have a powerful impact on how your body feels, how it tolerates treatment, etc. We want to make slow and steady changes in the right direction. You don't have to throw everything out in one day and start afresh. We need to remember that change takes time, and that we want these changes to be sustainable. Not to mention, we don't want drastic changes anyway when you're in treatment. So slow and steady changes in the right direction. You may start very simply by swapping a couple of meat meals for fish meals or vegetarian proteins. You can increase some of those beneficial fats that I mentioned, do some swaps when it comes to carbohydrates. Keep an eye out for refined sugar and processed foods. See whether you have a rainbow in your pantry, in your fridge, in your shopping cart. And as a really big one, make sure that every meal has a good quality source of protein. Key take-home messages: what you eat does matter, and informing yourself is always a good idea. Small changes can have a really big impact. You don't have to do everything at once. And ultimately, it's all about balance and finding the right thing that works for you and your body and your current situation. That's it for me thus far. Time absolutely flies in this session, and I do find that there was probably quite a lot of information there. If you have any questions at all, I very much encourage you to raise them now.